Good evening, everyone. Good evening. What a beautiful night to celebrate some of the dynamic women that have made an impact on Purdue University and our greater community. We're so thrilled that you're all here tonight. Thank you so much. I'm Ora M. Sweller, Duncan Hall Director, and on behalf of the Board of Directors, we'd like to say we're thrilled that you're here. Thank you so much. And we'd like to say we are thrilled to have Angie Klink come and celebrate with us the history and share with us her enthusiasm and knowledge. We'd like to recognize Sheila Klinker, Representative Sheila, who's here tonight. Joins, we appreciate that. And one of the luminaries we will be speaking about tonight is Betty Nelson, who is here tonight as well. And we'd like to recognize you. Thank you for being here as well. We'd like to say welcome back to John Norberg, who started off our series with a brilliant lecture. Discovering Lafayette is a lecture that Duncan Hall is co-sponsoring with your radio station, your public radio station from Purdue, WBAA. And I'd like to welcome Rachel Lattimore, who is Membership Director of WBAA.
Thank you, Ora. We were here just a few short months ago listening to John talk and lead us through some significant historical events at Purdue, which is wonderful because of the events that will happen next year. And we were standing out in the back area talking about what a great presentation it was, but we missed hearing about the women of Purdue. And it just so happened that evening, Angie Klink was in the audience. And so that whole discussion started. And this has been like just a crescendo. So we're very fortunate this evening to have Angie here. But to introduce Angie, we're going to call up John and keep this all in the family, because I think John can probably tell you a little bit more about Angie than we can. And I think that's the great way to segment in this. But as I was reaching out to the Purdue community, inviting more people to come to this particular event, a lot of the campus units kept saying to me, did you know she's an alumni, she's ours. So Angie, we're so glad that you belong to Purdue, but you belong to us as well. And I think we're in for a real treat tonight.
So, tag, I'm it. It's my turn to talk, and Angie, I'll try and get done so you can get up here, but you give me a microphone, and it's not always a good thing to do. I'm really happy to be here to introduce Angie, and I do want to say a couple things before I start there. First of all, go Boilers! We are going to celebrate our sesquicentennial. The celebration begins at homecoming this fall. I believe that's Mike, September 22nd. It'll go on until homecoming of the following year. Our actual birth date is May 6th, 2019. But we're going to spend a year celebrating it, so we got a lot to do. It's interesting you say, I didn't have enough on women. I probably didn't do enough. I'm sure I didn't do enough on women in that talk. And Betty and Angie made sure I knew that in my book, too, when they reviewed it. And I went back and added more on women and found myself 20,000 words over. And so I had to cut 20,000 other words, and I still didn't get enough in about all the women. This is a really important talk because there are women at Purdue throughout its history who really could have served as president of the university. They were fully qualified. They should have been considered. But guess what? They weren't. They weren't. I think Helen Schliemann, when Hovde retired, maybe you're going to talk about it, she sent in the names of 10 people she thought would make a good president, all of them women. I think you know where that suggestion went. Not very far at all. So it's very important to concentrate here at this talk and with some of the books that Angie's done on the role women played at Purdue. Women have had a tough history, as you all know. Women had a tough time getting into Purdue, getting accepted at Purdue. They were allowed in at the very beginning, but they were said they could take any courses they wanted to, but the Board of Trustees said, we think you'll be more interested in the stuff over here. which was basically arts and things like that. So it's a fascinating history, and you're going to enjoy Angie's talk. I don't know how long I've known Angie, maybe forever. I can't remember the first time I met her. She was born in Frankfurt. Her family moved here when she was 4 years old, and she's been here ever since. How long have you been writing now? Since she graduated from Purdue. Okay. She writes biographies, histories, documentaries, children's books, essays, all kinds of great books. I've read all of her books. They are super. One of them we talk about, I'm sure she's going to talk about these tonight, the Dean's Bible, which Betty Nelson is in, about our women's deans and dean of students. Kirby's Way, about Kirby and Carol and Risk. What wonderful community people they were, and to have their story captured and told. It's a wonderful story, and these books are for sale out here if you want to get it. I really recommend them. Divided Paths, Common Ground, it really does a beautiful history of early agriculture, extension, home economics, just a wonderful story, a great, great history. She's also written 2 children's books. One of them is called Purdue Pete Finds His Hammer, and the other one is called I Found You. Now, you might guess where the I Found You is about. It's another university. I did buy Purdue Pete Finds His Hammer for my grandchildren. I have to admit, I did not buy I Found You for my grandchildren, but I read it, and it's equally as clever and also a really super book. Angie writes scripts. She wrote the script for Rise Above the Mark, narrated by Peter Coyote. Her son filmed it. It was a great documentary. She has 2 essays in Undeniably Indiana, the Indiana State Bicentennial book. She has authored 4 titles in Chicken Soup for the Soul. So she's done a lot of work, and a lot more just beside the women of Purdue. But she, more than anyone else in all of our history, has focused on doing a super job in telling us about the role women played in the university. She's received 57 Addy Awards and an honorable mention in the 2007 Irma Bombeck Writers Competition. Her honors go on and on and on. And maybe the most important one of all is she's a graduate of the Brian Lamb School of Communications. So it's my honor to present Angie Klink.
That was very nice, John. Thank you for being here tonight, because I know there's a lot happening in the community, because we have such a vital community, and you had other places you could have chosen to be, and you chose to be here. So thank you. And thank you to Duncan Hall and WBAA for sponsoring this great event. I think it's a great idea to bring the community together, and it's kind of an old-fashioned, vintage sort of venue to appreciate stories in history. And the last time I presented here, I was 10 years old. It was my piano recital with Mrs. Strathman, and she stood over here, and I played on the grand piano, and I walked past her, and she said, "You didn't make a single mistake." So I hope tonight I can again play all my notes correctly at Duncan Hall. So, need my remote. So, tonight I'm going to talk about women who were significant to Purdue and to the community, and how they were connected to one another and to this very place, Thomas Duncan Hall. This is Ladies' Hall, the first permanent building constructed on the north side of State Street on campus. And the building originally housed faculty and their families in the president's office. As a child, John T. McCutcheon lived in Ladies' Hall for about a year when his father ran the dining room. McCutcheon, as you know, became a Pulitzer Prize-winning cartoonist. Well, he drew this cartoon of Ladies' Hall, and when he was a student, when he returned as a student, he again went to Ladies' Hall, because that's the only place where all the meals were served. But for most of its existence, Ladies' Hall was a women's residence, a laboratory, and classroom for home economics classes. So in 1892, an issue of the Purdue Exponent reveals how women's higher education was viewed then. It was titled The Advancement of Woman. And the article states, quote, "During the last quarter century, woman has felt that the world was watching her educational development, regarding it as an experiment, probably a useless one, and possibly dangerous to the health of coming generations." But the article ends on a high note with a statement that rings true today. Quote, "Too long has woman been considered all heart and man all mind. The time has come when we realize that the great man must also possess a tender heart and the noble woman an imperial intellect." Amen. So as early as 1913, Purdue's women students were longing for a new building. More space was needed for classes in home economics, and Ladies' Hall needed repairs. Plaster was falling from the ceiling into the students' bread dough. Home economics courses were women's foot in the door to higher education. Few women ventured into engineering or agriculture, as those were looked upon as men's venues. Home economics is science, and it was one of the many roots, or is many of the roots of today's College of Health and Human Sciences at Purdue. So this is a page from my husband's great Aunt Bertha Kriegbum's scrapbook. And my husband couldn't be here tonight. I think he's being FaceTimed in. Hi, dear. But his sisters are here, Carol and Marilyn. So this is their great Aunt Bertha Kriegbum's scrapbook, which we are privileged to have in our archives in Steve's closet. So got it out, and I took this picture. So Aunt Bertha lived in Ladies' Hall, and she graduated in 1922. So here she is with her fellow students and her instructor on the steps of Ladies' Hall. The Ladies' Hall fire escape was a popular place for pictures. So let's go up the steps with Aunt Bertha and take a look inside. This is, I assume, Aunt Bertha's room. It's from her scrapbook. It's a slice of 1920s dorm life. This was the year women won their right to vote in the United States. Here, a sewing class. You can really see the light, the tall windows, how they're dressed all in white, sewing away. Cooking laboratory. Purdue's domestic economy courses were first offered in the School of Science. The 1907 degree yearbook described the courses as, quote, "scientific study of food principles, chemical and microscopic composition of food, nutritive value of foods, food preservation, and dietetics." It was science. Scientists had just discovered that diseases such as beriberi, scurvy, and rickets were caused by diets lacking certain foods. I mean, we know that today. It's common knowledge. But back then, it was a brand new discovery, and it was taught and studied in domestic economy classes. Judging bread at Purdue. I think this would be a dream job because you have an excuse for eating carbs. So, here are the women displaying their bread. I love, one-handed to the side, two-handed in front. They have their different methods of how they're going to display their bread. And, you couldn't go to a store and buy a loaf of bread. So it was important to know how to bake good bread. It was important to your family, and most families were very, very large at that time. So these home economics classes were hard-won. It took several years of convincing and political pressure for Purdue President Winthrop Stone to institute courses in home economics and draw more women to the university. These were the two leaders who advocated for the establishment of home economics at Purdue, Virginia Claypool Meredith, and Professor of Agriculture William C. Latta. Virginia Meredith led an astonishing life for a woman of that era, or even for a woman of today. She would become the first woman to be appointed to Purdue's Board of Trustees in 1921 and hold significant sway upon the direction of Purdue University. There she is at age 16. They called her Jenny back then. Born near Connorsville, Indiana in 1848, Virginia joined her father on wagon rides to his fields and learned of his successful farming practices. She graduated with honors from Glendale Female College in Glendale, Ohio, a premier private school. Then she married Henry Clay Meredith, who was the son of Civil War General Solomon Meredith, and they moved into the general's home, the landmark Oakland Farm near Cambridge City, Indiana, and it's still there. That's a very current picture of it. Her husband and father-in-law raised renowned shorthorn cattle on their 450-acre farm, while she helped her mother-in-law run the household. But within a 12-year span, her in-laws passed away and her husband passed away. And so at the age of 34, she had a choice. She could go back and live with her parents, which was probably expected during that time, or she could choose to manage the farm, and you guessed it, she chose the farm. And that was unprecedented for a woman of that time. She chose the farm, and her path would catapult her into national recognition and make a profound mark on Purdue University. Virginia Meredith was a conspicuous sight. A woman stock breeder was unheard of, and sometimes she was met with disapproval and scorn. Yet she proved herself. Her animals competed well against the livestock shown by men. And she became an astute farm manager, and this opened doors to speaking engagements about livestock production to mostly male audiences. So at this time, farmers' institutes were established, and these were meetings with programs on the latest in agricultural practices. And the Farmers Institute Act of 1889 assigned the management of Farmers Institutes to Purdue University. Professor of Agriculture William C. Latta managed the program, and so Virginia Meredith was in the right place at the right time. Latta strongly believed that Purdue should offer women an education, so he included topics at Farmers Institutes that appealed to women. And he asked Meredith to speak. The institutes launched her career as a speaker and a writer. She wrote a column for the Breeders' Gazette, and she became Latta's close colleague. But in the middle of her budding career, Virginia Meredith also became a single mother. 7 years after Virginia Meredith became a lady farmer, her best friend, Hattie Matthews, was dying. Hattie was such a good friend, she'd named her son Meredith. Well, Hattie asked Virginia if she could adopt her 2 children when she was gone, and Virginia consented. So at the age of 40, Virginia Meredith adopted 7-year-old Mary Matthews and her 2-year-old brother. So Virginia was a wonderful role model for Mary Matthews, who traveled with her mother as she spoke at Farmers Institutes. This set Matthews' life course and would lead her to becoming Purdue's first dean of the School of Home Economics. Many people thought Virginia Meredith was Mary Matthews' aunt because she called her Auntie. So Virginia garnered and gained national prominence when she was appointed to the board of lady managers. It was like they put the word lady in front of everything when it was a woman doing something. Lady managers for the 1893 Chicago World's Fair. And the board determined how contributions by women would be managed at the exposition and bestowed awards to women. Well, Virginia protested that there would be a separate building for women that they called the Women's Building. She said the interests of women are not a thing apart from the interests of mankind. So here's a poster featuring all the lady managers. Virginia is number 9. At the top is Bertha Palmer. She was president of the board, and her husband owned Palmer House in Chicago, the hotel. Virginia was one of Bertha Palmer's circle of advisors dubbed the favored few. Well, Virginia's work with the World's Fair garnered her celebrity status that followed her whole life, and she was often introduced as the lady manager from Indiana. Well, in 1895, she joined governors and other dignitaries to speak at Vicksburg, Mississippi, and her speech was record-breaking because at that time in the South, it was considered inappropriate for a woman to speak in public. Well, the audience was captivated, and during the final ceremonies, Virginia presented with a gold medal from the state of Mississippi, and the gold medal said, "The Queen of American Agriculture." And this is Fred Whitford's excellent book on Virginia Meredith. So 2 years later, Virginia Meredith was hired at the University of Minnesota to start a home economics program there. It's not switching. There it is. Coming? Well, shoot. Where is Eric? Oh. Well, it's not. What do you think? Shoot. It is red instead of green. Go ahead and switch it to the next one, Eric, if you can. Okay. I might have to have you switch it, but I'll just tell you when. Okay? So, where was I? Yes, okay, yes. 2 years later, Virginia Meredith was hired at the University of Minnesota to start a home economics program there. And Mary Matthews was 15 when she moved to Minnesota with her mother. Matthews became the first woman to earn a bachelor's degree in home economics from the University of Minnesota. Yet Purdue still did not have a home economics program established. Eric? Virginia Meredith and Mary Matthews returned to West Lafayette, and Virginia continued to help Professor Latta attempt to gain support for home economics at Purdue. Meanwhile, Mary Matthews taught clothing at the Lafayette Free Kindergarten and Industrial School. Later, her graduate students would also teach sewing and cooking there. This school was established in 1896 by a group of Lafayette women, and in 1922 merged with the Community House Association, the precursor to today's Thomas Duncan Hall Board of Directors. Okay, Eric. Same. Thank you. Finally, in 1905, President Winthrop Stone created a Department of Household Economics within the School of Science at Purdue. By this time, many of the land-grant universities had already formed departments of home economics. Purdue historians William Hepburn and Lewis Sears wrote, and I quote, "The action of Purdue in 1905 was considerably belated. The university deserves no credit as a pioneer." In the fall of 1912, Mary Matthews, aged 30, was made head of the Department of Household Economics, and there were about 40 women on campus at the time, just 40 women. She would become a powerhouse in home economics and the advancement of women at Purdue for the next 40 years. In 1999, Matthews was elected posthumously to Purdue's inaugural Book of Great Teachers. Change the slide. The Cooperative Extension Service was organized in 1914. The mission: help people help themselves by taking the university to the people. Lulla Reed Gaddis was hired as the first state leader of home demonstration in the Extension Department. She grew up on a farm in Rossville. Decades later, in the 1960s, Gaddis would serve on the board of Duncan Hall, and she was on the Tea Room and Rental Rates Committee. Tea room is important. Like a beacon of hope, Gaddis arrived on farm women's doorsteps carrying her home demonstration suitcase. She and the agents she hired took the teachings of Purdue to rural women who worked from dawn until dusk for their large families. Often what they knew of running a household, raising children, and working the farm was handed down by word of mouth from their mothers. Most had no electricity or running water. They knew nothing of nutrition, sanitation, and food preservation. Through home demonstrations, Gaddis and her staff changed the lives of Indiana women. Next slide. There's a story that was told to me by the late Purdue Dean Emeritus of the School of Home Economics, Eva Goebel. How many of you knew Eva Goebel? A lot of you. She died last year at age 107. I first knew her when she was turning 100. So she was very young when I first got to know her. But the story she told me weaves like a fable. Before Lulla Gaddis was hired as state leader of home demonstration, she had worked for Mary Matthews in the Department of Home Economics. And when extension began, Matthews assumed Gaddis, her newly created position, and its funding would be under her Department of Household Economics. After all, she had trained Gaddis. But one night, Lulla Gaddis was stolen from Mary Matthews. Next slide. According to Eva Goebel, on a night in 1914, while the campus slumbered, the Purdue Ag Boys, that's what Eva always called them, the Ag Boys, hooked up a team of horses to a wagon, climbed aboard, and trekked it north across the dirt thoroughfare that was State Street to Ladies' Hall. The Ag Boys entered Ladies' Hall and carried out the furniture, files, and records they believed should be on their side. They filled the wagon, gave a yank to the reins, and the horses moved the office of Lola Gaddis, the new state leader of home demonstration, to the ag side. Next slide. The following day, Gaddis reported to the Department of Agricultural Extension. She no longer worked for the Department of Household Economics, headed by Mary Matthews. But Matthews was incensed. Next slide. Let's see Mary Matthews. Is she looking incensed? Maybe. It was then that the paths of Matthews and Gaddis were divided. They would go forth in the decades to come with the same mission to educate women, but with watchful eyes upon one another. Thus, the title of my book about these two leaders, Divided Paths, Common Ground. Women did not yet have the right to vote when this was all happening. The positions held by Gaddis and Matthews within the American institutions of the land-grant university and cooperative extension were made possible by a government in which they had no say. So they can just be stolen from one another, you know. Next slide. So Lola Gaddis encouraged women to gather so she could teach ways to lessen their household burdens while socializing with one another, and this was the beginning of Home Economics Club. Next, Eric. A popular demonstration was the Dress Form Project. It was a homemade dress form made as an exact duplicate of a woman's figure to be used for sewing. The making of a dress form took patience. The woman stood perfectly still as several women worked quickly to apply strips of gummed paper dipped in water around her entire body from neck to below the hips. It was uncomfortable and wet, as you can imagine. And once the form dried and stiffened, it was so constricting that many women fainted. They couldn't breathe. And so the form, after it was cut off, was taped and then put on a stand, and you had your dress form. Next slide. So much of what I learned about Lola Gaddis was through diaries kept by her sister Bertha Kate. This is 1902. Lola is on the left and her sister Kate on the right. The little boy is their nephew Paul Riley, whom they adored. The sisters lived together their entire lives, for neither married because they couldn't be married and have their careers. Back then, once a woman married, it was understood that she would quit her job. Kate was a school teacher for more than 50 years at Washington School here in Lafayette. Next slide. So here, Lola is on the right. You can see their personalities and their body language. Lola met life head on, and she was very sure of herself. Kate was a homebody who kept many of her thoughts hidden. Miriam Epple Heath, how many of you know Mimi or Miriam Epple Heath, Westminster? Well, she's the great niece-in-law of the Gaddis sisters, and I visited her to learn more about her aunts when I was researching the book, and Miriam gave me a light blue shoebox. Next slide. They obviously held nurses' shoes. Go ahead with the next one, Eric. Inside were 18 leather-bound diaries. They were like gold, believe me. Faithfully, Kate Gaddis wrote a few lines about her life each day for 40 years, from 1906 until 1946, and I read every word. Kate was 38 when she first wrote in her diaries, and she died at age 78. Next slide. Kate wrote of Purdue events and world events, Purdue Memorial Union, and what is today Dumey Hall, the first women's residence hall that took Meredith 13 years of striving to see built. After she became a trustee, Meredith, age 72, was named president of the Purdue Memorial Union Association and became a principal in the design, construction, financing, and management of the union. The building was erected as a memorial to alums who served in the Civil War and World War I. Throughout the 1920s, raising money to build the union turned out to be an ongoing, agonizing process. Those who paid a pledge of $100 or more to the building fund became life members of the association, and their names were inscribed on a bronze plaque that still is displayed in the Great Hall. In fact, Steve's great aunt Bertha has her name on that plaque. And my son Ross, who's here, she's his great, great Aunt Bertha. So you walk on hallowed ground at Purdue. Next slide. So the groundbreaking for the union was June 13th, 1922, and Meredith introduced her fellow trustee, David Ross, Lulla's significant other, who turned over the first spade of dirt. And minutes before the ceremony began, Virginia Meredith looked on the ground and she found a 4-leaf clover. And she picked it and later had it framed, and today it is in Purdue University archives. But at first the clover did not bring good luck. Many pledges were not being honored, and construction on the union was delayed. The union opened partially finished with pine boards as flooring in 1924 to start generating revenue in the cafeteria. Virginia Meredith was 80 years old when she saw the union completed in 1930. Next slide. At Virginia Meredith's first Board of Trustees meeting in 1921, she voted with the board to authorize the construction of the Home Economics Building at the corner of State and University Streets. It was named after her daughter, Mary Matthews, in 1976, when by then both had passed away. So when you go by this building, you can see today that either marble or cement slabs cover those words that say Home Economics Building that are carved into the stone. Next slide. So in 1926, the School of Home Economics was established at Purdue, and Mary Matthews was named the very first dean. Matthews assigned Professor Laura Parch to begin Indiana's first nursery school and become the director. The Purdue Nursery School was where Beering Hall is today. Next slide. Amelia Earhart visited the playground outside of the nursery school. Earhart, as you may know, was a visiting instructor and counselor for women at Purdue from 35 to 37. And as you may know, her flying laboratory, the Lockheed Electra, she flew on her last flight, was funded by Purdue Research Foundation. Next slide. And there is much about the remarkable women I've talked about thus far in Divided Paths Common Ground, and it's published by Purdue University Press, so I want to give them some credit. Next slide. Carolyn Shoemaker. She was Purdue's first part-time Dean of Women, a native of Lafayette. She earned her master's degree from Purdue in 1888. Two of her classmates were the famous author George Ade and John T. McCutcheon. For 11 years, she set aside her goal of being a teacher to care for her invalid mother. After her mother passed away, Shoemaker became a Purdue English literature instructor. Next slide. She was an inspiring professor and a dynamic speaker. She gave book reviews and speeches to clubs and organizations throughout Indiana. Shoemaker was appointed Purdue's first Dean of Women in 1913. And there's a story regarding her appointment that has been repeated in the history of Purdue. The story goes that Purdue President Winthrop Stone called Carolyn Shoemaker, age 48, into his office and offered her the position of Dean of Women. Many universities were appointing deans of women, and as he said, he guessed Purdue should too. So Shoemaker was surprised and in awe of such a responsibility, and she told Stone she was not sure she could handle such a job. And Stone bellowed, "Be a man, Miss Shoemaker. Be a man." I don't laugh. I bristle every time I hear that, because I'm a woman and that's what I'm going to be. But Carolyn Shoemaker gave the largest donation by a woman to the building of the Memorial Union, $5,000. And you know she got paid much less than the men. She struggled for decades to see a women's residence hall built. Purdue Dean of Men Stanley Coulter said of Shoemaker, "Purdue was not part of her life. Purdue was her life, because you also couldn't be married if you were a woman in such a position." Her power was as a teacher and as a woman lay in the warmth of her feelings. Dean Carolyn Shoemaker led Purdue very much like a woman. Next slide. Shoemaker played a significant role in the formation of the Lafayette Community House Association, a founding thread of Duncan Hall. On Valentine's Day, during World War I, she gave an infamous speech to a group of women at Trinity Church entitled Civic Needs. She talked of a great need for a meeting place and shelter for women of Lafayette. She inspired the movement to form the Community House Association and purchased a house to serve as a center for women. Shoemaker gave generously to the cause and became a life member of the Community House Association board. She was also a founding member of the West Lafayette Public Library and was instrumental in building the library's first collection. Virginia Meredith also helped with the push for a West Lafayette library. Next slide. So on March 1st, 1933, Shoemaker was scheduled to speak here at Duncan Hall to the 20th Century Club, but she failed to show up. Club members were alarmed because that was not like her, and so they contacted Purdue. A janitor at Varsity Apartments, where Shoemaker lived, was summoned, and Varsity Apartments still over in the village. He unlocked Shoemaker's door and found the dean unconscious. She was rushed by ambulance to St. Elizabeth Hospital, where she died of a stroke and kidney failure at age 68. Purdue and the community were in shock. Purdue closed during Shoemaker's funeral at Central Presbyterian Church, where she taught Sunday school. Later, a memorial service was also held at Eliza Fowler Hall. This tribute book, which Stephanie Schmitz gave me one day from Archives, it was a memorial for her memorial service, and President Edward Elliott said of Carolyn Shoemaker in the book, "She was the ideal public servant, having a keen sense of duty, a broad and understanding human sympathy, and above all, an infinite capacity of self-forgetfulness. The university is bowed in grief today in memory of her beloved character." Next slide. So Carolyn Shoemaker bequeathed funds for the purpose of helping women at Purdue. And in 1938, her gift was used for a new women's cooperative house, initially named Twin Pines. In 1940, Twin Pines voted to change the name to Shoemaker Cooperative House, and the women of Shoemaker were referred to as the Cobblers. Another co-op would later be founded by Lella Gaddis and be named Twin Pines. Joyce lived at Twin Pines as an audience. And it was for women who majored in home economics. Today, the women students of Shoemaker Cooperative affectionately refer to Carolyn Shoemaker as Ma Shoe. And one of their philanthropic endeavors has been a shoe drive for those in need. Next slide. So, we need a new dean, and Purdue President Edward Elliott hired Dorothy C. Stratton, age 34, a high school dean and vice principal in California, to succeed Carolyn Shoemaker. Stratton became Purdue's first full-time Dean of Women in 1933. Next slide. So Dorothy Stratton arrived at Purdue and climbed to the top of Eliza Fowler Hall, where the office of the Dean of Women was located. She discovered that it was more like the closet of the Dean of Women, very small, about 6 by 8 feet. She began to move her books and papers into Carolyn Shoemaker's empty desk, and she opened a drawer and found in its shadowy recesses a book. It was Carolyn Shoemaker's Bible. Was the Bible inadvertently left inside of Shoemaker's desk? Or did the person with the unpleasant task of clearing her belongings elect to leave the Bible for the next dean? No one knows. Stratton placed the Bible back in the drawer and continued her mission to cultivate the office of the Dean of Women. Next slide. You may know the rest of the story if you've read the book. Carolyn Shoemaker's Bible was secretly handed down through the succession of these 5 deans for nearly a century. As each woman preceded the other, she wrote her name and favorite Bible passage in the front matter of the good book and then handed it down. This iconic photo is known as 5 Deans Walking. Often faced with obstacles, stereotypes, and discrimination, each woman led with grace, tenacity, and impeccable class. They opened avenues for women and became conduits for change, fostering opportunities for all people. They were loved by students and revered by colleagues. Next slide. So the Bible became a talisman, a symbol of the women's shared profession and their sisterhood. They were a close, connected clutch of women, a chosen family. Today, the Bible is preserved in Purdue University archives. Next slide. Dorothy Stratton and Helen Schliemann met in the Purdue Women's Gym. Schliemann was a graduate student and taught physical education. Next slide. So after Ladies' Hall was torn down in 1927, women students were displaced. Some lived in sororities on campus or rented rooms in nearby homes, but it was difficult to attract more women to campus when there was nowhere for them to live for nearly 6 years. The Women's Residence Hall, for which Virginia Meredith and Carolyn Shoemaker had advocated for so long, opened in 1934, and Dorothy Stratton hired Helen Schliemann as the hall's director. The residence would eventually be named Jimmy Hall as part of Windsor, and unfortunately Shoemaker did not live to see the grand opening. Next slide. So the following year, President Edward Elliott brought Amelia Earhart to campus as a visiting faculty member and women's counselor. Here is Dorothy Stratton, Amelia Earhart, Frank E. Hakama, assistant to President Elliott, and Claire A. Coolidge, assistant dean of women. Earhart lived in the new Women's Residence Hall, and her office was located within the office of the dean of women. So both Dorothy Stratton and Helen Schliemann became very good friends with Amelia Earhart. Stratton and Schliemann corresponded with Earhart to plan her visits to campus. Schliemann was responsible for finding a garage to house Earhart's sleek gray sports car. Oh, for a picture of that. Stratton invited Earhart to her home for Sunday dinners. Well, Dorothy Stratton never cooked. Right, Sally? But for Amelia Earhart, she made waffles. I knew you'd laugh. I'll take a drink now. Yeah, for some reason, waffles. Next slide. So President Elliott also brought Lillian Gilbreth to campus the same year he brought Earhart. Gilbreth was a visiting professor of mechanical engineering and was the first woman in the U.S. to hold such a position. She was a pioneer in time and motion studies and one of the world's few female authorities in industrial engineering and management. Her quest was always to find the one best way. While at Purdue, Gilbreth acted as consultant at Duncan Electric Company in Lafayette. This was the company founded by Thomas Duncan, who gave the funds to build Duncan Hall. Everything is connected. She and her husband had 12 children, by the way, and their story was told in the book and movie Cheaper by the Dozen. So Dorothy Stratton and Helen Schliemann played hostess to the two most renowned women of the time, Amelia Earhart and Lillian Gilbreth. When she was on campus, Gilbreth stayed in the Women's Residence Hall with Amelia. So you got Amelia and you got Lillian walking around the residence hall. And she also became good friends with Stratton and Schliemann, who called her Dr. G. Stratton also invited Gilbreth over for dinner, and guess what she made her? Waffles. Yeah. So Earhart and Gilbreth were role models for what women can accomplish and set the foundation for Dorothy Stratton and Helen Schliemann to lead women on Purdue's campus and during World War II. Next slide. Well, they also authored a book. They co-authored a book, Your Best Foot Forward, Social Usage for Young Moderns. It was written to help students with correct social behavior, for dating, dances, table manners, and more. And as research, they quizzed students across the country. And in the book's acknowledgments, they thanked Lillian Gilbreth, so she must have helped them in some way. The book was first published in 1940 and then 15 years later, and these are the two different book covers from those times. Next slide. So this photo brings together many of the women I just talked about. Virginia Meredith Center made her last public speech at this dinner, celebrating the 10th anniversary of the School of Home Economics in 1936. 200 leaders in home economics from the state and the community attended. Lola Gaddis was there. She's not in the picture. She might have been nudged out. I don't know. And Meredith was 88, and her speech was titled The Gracious Woman. Next slide. During World War II, Gilbreth was an advisor, Lillian Gilbreth, for WAVES, and it's the Women's Reserve of the Navy. She encouraged Dean of Women Dorothy Stratton to enlist in the WAVES, and it was a complete break. It changed Stratton's life. Stratton wasn't away for long, though, because she received a telegram telling her to report to Washington as soon as possible. The Coast Guard was looking for a woman to direct their women's reserve, and Stratton was hired nearly on the spot by a room full of admirals. Stratton selected Helen Schliemann as her executive officer, her right-hand woman, so she called Helen Schliemann at Purdue, and Helen was sworn into the Coast Guard over the telephone. Next. Stratton had the job of naming the Coast Guard Women's Reserve. She decided on spars, from the Coast Guard motto, Semper Paratus, which means always ready. Spar also means a supporting beam of a ship. The women of spars took over stateside jobs held by Coast Guard men who were then free to go to war. Next. Meanwhile, Beverly Stone, who would become Purdue's fourth Dean of Women, was in the waves. So Stratton, Schliemann, and Stone were moving in concentric circles. In the next decade, they would intersect at Purdue University. Next. Dorothy Stratton, from 1950 to 1960, was the national director of the Girl Scouts of America. She was the head honcho for Girl Scouts. And Helen Schliemann was named Purdue's next Dean of Women. This is when Stratton cleaned out her desk at Purdue and decided to write her name, date, and favorite Bible passage in Carolyn Shoemaker's Bible and pass it to Helen Schliemann. Next. So one of the first things Dean of Women Helen Schliemann questioned when she returned to Purdue from spars was the concept of women's hours. At a set time each night, the women's residence hall was locked, and the women students had to be in for the night. Schliemann had seen Coast Guard women, the same ages as college women, given the freedom to manage their own lives without a curfew. So Helen said, "Stop locking the women up." But when she suggested that women students have their keys to their residence halls, she was nearly fired. Truly, it took 20 years for women's residence hours to be eliminated. In 1968, Purdue was the first Big Ten school to abolish women's hours policy. Well, Helen Schliemann asked every woman she knew an important question. Do you have your go-to-hell fund? I know, this is what she asked. Do you have your go-to-hell fund? Meaning, do you have fallback money if your job goes sour or your marriage and you want to walk away? And this was shocking in the 1950s and 1960s that she would ask women this. And it was unheard of, but that was Helen. Next slide. So in 1962, Schliemann received a telegram from Eleanor Roosevelt. It was an invitation to serve on the Education Committee of President Kennedy's Commission on the Status of Women. Eleanor chaired the commission. The final report was titled American Women, and it was groundbreaking. It documented workplace discrimination, recommended affordable child care, equal employment opportunities, and paid maternity leave. Still hot topics today. Next. So, here's Beverly Stone. How many of you knew Beverly Stone? Yeah. Well, how many of you knew Helen Schliemann? Yeah, I know you do, Sally. Well, Beverly Stone was both grace and grit. Born in Norfolk, Virginia, she had an old Virginia voice. A reporter once described it as soft and warm as the mellow glow of antique silver. One of Stone's legacies is the Purdue Mortarboard calendar. Students in the Mortarboard National Honor Society were expected to sell the calendar, but they were busy, and peddling a calendar was not what they wanted to do. So Stone came up with the brilliant idea to ask campus bookstores to sell the calendar. It seems obvious now, but that was, a good idea. And so today, still, campus bookstores sell thousands of mortarboard calendars. So Beverly Stone became Purdue's first Dean of Students in 1974. This is when universities around the country were combining the office of the Dean of Men and the office of Dean of Women to form the Dean of Students. And most universities, it would be the Dean of Men who would become the Dean of Students, but not at Purdue. Beverly Stone became the Dean of Students. Next. Well, after Stone retired from Purdue, West Lafayette Mayor Sonia Marjoram asked her to run for city council in 1983. Helen Schliemann, Beverly Stone, and Barbara Cook had been supportive advisors to Sonia when she ran for mayor of West Lafayette. So as you may know, Marjoram became the first female mayor of the city. So Bev Stone's favorite color was pink. So she purchased pink stationery. And she and her friends created handwritten notes to use for her campaign. An alumni who loved Stone volunteered to hand out the pink notes in neighborhoods. So the sweetest political propaganda this side of the Mason-Dixon line handily won Beverly Stone's race for city council. Next. Barbara Cook. She was like Scout in To Kill a Mockingbird. From Memphis, Tennessee, she was a tomboy who loved the outdoors. She had a strong and unwavering sense of social justice. In 1972, President Richard Nixon signed an amendment to the Civil Rights Act that changed American women's lives forever. Title IX says that no person in the United States can be excluded from any education program that receives federal dollars. Well, a wave of girls and women poured onto athletic fields and into non-traditional occupations. But Barbara Cook was president of the National Association for Women Deans, an advisor to Mortar Board, both all-female organizations. So she guided those entities as they welcomed men. She said, and I quote, "It takes strong women to work in a man's world. It also takes strong and understanding men to work in a woman's world." Barbara Cook became Dean of Students in 1980, and Beverly Stone secretly bequeathed Carolyn Shoemaker's Bible to her friend and colleague of nearly 50 years. Next, we have Betty Nelson, sitting right here. She has been known to be the iron fist in a velvet glove. Originally from Bluefield, West Virginia, Betty arrived at Purdue in 1965 and worked in the Department of Psychological Sciences. She met Assistant Dean of Women Barbara Cook in the stairwell. Soon after, Nelson was offered a position in the office of the Dean of Women. And that was when the four women, Helen Schliemann, Beverly Stone, Barbara Cook, and Betty Nelson began working side by side in the Dean of Women office, forming a lifelong friendship and sisterhood that would eventually be interconnected by Carolyn Shoemaker's Bible. Next. Betty Nelson was an assistant Dean of Women when the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 came calling. Betty led the charge to make Purdue accessible to those with disabilities, adding elevators, curb cuts, handicapped parking, handicapped restrooms, and much more. She was told at a conference, "It's easier to move a cemetery than to change a university." So Betty Nelson is shown here with Greg Portman. He was one of the first students in a wheelchair to graduate from Purdue. And Greg headed the idea for student organizations to sponsor the creation of sidewalk curb cuts. And pictured on the bottom right is a curb cut that was in front of the former Engineering Administration building, no longer exists. But the Film Society sponsored that curb cut, and so their name was pressed into the cement. Next. The deans gathered for the dedication of the Helen B. Schliemann Hall of Student Services on April 21st, 1990. And Beverly Stone, of course, if you knew Bev Stone, she liked furs and faux pearls. And so she's wearing one of her famous furs right there in that. Next. So 4 of the deans are honored with Purdue Gateway markers that if you drive on campus, you probably drive by them all the time. They say, "This is Purdue University." And Beverly Stone's marker flanks the Purdue Memorial Union at State and Grant Street. Next. Barbara Cook's is at Northwestern and Stadium Avenues near Lambert Fieldhouse. Next. And Betty Nelson's is at Grant and Northwestern. While Stone, Cook, and Nelson hug the Purdue campus with gateway markers, and Schliemann anchors the center of campus with the Schliemann Hall of Student Services, Dorothy Stratton hugs the coast of the United States. Next. The Coast Guard named a national security cutter in honor of Captain Dorothy Stratton. The cutter is the first named in honor of a woman. In 2012, Michelle Obama commissioned the ship, the first time in history that a First Lady sponsored a Coast Guard or Navy ship. Next. So today, the Stratton protects the borders of the United States, saves those in peril, and safeguards interests around the globe. Next. So the five deans are honored collectively with the Dean's Commons and Conference Room. It's in the Kroc Leadership Center. And a plaque in the room displays the iconic five deans walking photo, and it was taken by former Purdue photographer Dave Umberger, and he was there for the dedication and got to see it. Next. I've only skimmed, the surface of these extraordinary lives of the five deans who passed down Carolyn Shoemaker's Bible, but I want to tell you a little more about that photo. The deans were all present except Helen Schliemann, who passed away in 1992. Each woman you see here had been a secret guardian of Carolyn Shoemaker's Bible. Today, the Bible is preserved in Purdue University archives. So I thank you.